Let me welcome everyone. And before we begin the proper session of the panel today, I wanted to voice a few quick but essential thank yous to our co-sponsors, our gratitude for making this weekend possible. The co-sponsors include the Jean and Samuel Frankel Center for Judaic Studies, the Institute for the Humanities, the International Institute, the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, and the Rackham Graduate School. And thanks to all of those. I'm Douglas Northrop. I am the current director of REES, the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, an entity that may be familiar to a few of you in this room, I hope. For those of you who are counting the list of such directors on our program, I hope everyone has one of these. You'll see that I am the 19th director of REES. I hadn't known that before. And you'll also note on the gorgeous timeline that is on the back of the program that my picture sits right at the very end of that timeline. So clearly this has all led right up to me, and I'm very pleased about that. And so with that iconography in mind, I thought I'd take as my model for these quick opening remarks the 24th Party Congress of 1971, when REES was 10 years old. And as you'll all recall, I'm sure, Leonid Ilyich, who was a director of a rather different sort on that occasion, spoke for a tidy 6 hours. So this is everyone's ideal for public speaking. According to the official account, he was interrupted by applause 169 times. I knew that we had a sharp group out there. I'm so pleased to see it. Of course, I plan to welcome you far more briefly than that, this being the University of Michigan. We're already well underway, following an excellent panel earlier this afternoon at Frankel. And of course, that's because we wanted to begin this reunion at 90 miles per hour, which according to my math is 135.8 versts per hour, just so you know. And as you're also aware, there's much more yet to come. So on behalf of my predecessors, no fewer than 7 of whom should be in this room right now, and 3 more who sent their greetings from afar, and my successor who's also here, that means 60% of the directors of REES are present and wishing in today. Let me formally welcome back all of you to this reunion weekend. That's alumni, current students, prospective students, staff, research associates, emeritus, and current faculty. There are 170 registered for this weekend, coming from 12 states and 2 countries. And I wanted also to greet those who couldn't attend in person and have sent us electronic and snail mail greetings and wishes. Many of those are listening and watching on the webcast of this event. It's not 1961 any longer. I'm being telecast like Brezhnev. I'd like to think of it that way. Thank you. Catherine, I knew I could count on you. We have alumni here from as recent as, well, almost alumni. We have 17 more alums about to be minted next month, stretching as far back, I believe, as far as 1956. Roger Hamburg is here, and his degree even predates REES. And we have faculty here during this event as far back as 1953, when Asya Humeski came to Michigan. The main purpose of this weekend, of course, is to bring all of us together, across the generations, across geographies, across disciplines, and across careers, to have fun, and also, I hope, to mark some of the many legacies of REES in its first half-century. And this being Michigan, we also intend to put you to work as well, collectively reflecting on where we can go from here, too. I'm going to make just 2 more points before I step out of the way. One, at the outset, I want to put front and center for everyone here the people who usually are behind the scenes. That is the staff who made this reunion possible. For today, that means especially Marisha Ostafin. More than 25 years at the center. Also Donna Parmalee, more than 20 years at the center. And Rachel Brichta, more than 5. And I don't see any of them standing. I'm going to ask anyone who's in the room who's now on staff or has been a member of staff, please to stand up. I don't need to tell this, and they're probably out there, I don't need to tell this crowd that these are the people who really deserve recognition. People like Darlene Brightener, who has worked at REES for 40 of its 50 years. And that's, of course, the year of Brezhnev's speech. That was my last reference back to Brezhnev. For the last 50 years, these are the people who have made the center hum, who have kept things on track through the vagaries of all of those absent-minded directors, present company excluded, of course. So please join me in thanking the staff for all they've done. And then one last thing, we are in the process, as part of the lead up to this weekend and this weekend itself, of recording histories of the center. That is, recording staff as well as faculty, memories of everything that has happened up to this point. And we hope that what you're about to hear, as well as the connections that you make and renew this weekend, may spur more thoughts, reflections, suggestions, memories. Olga Verkhovskaya, who is a REES MA alumna, and now at the Bentley Library, has been carrying out a series of interviews with past directors and staff. Several of those will soon be available on YouTube. Again, this is not 1961 any longer. But we'll send out an email about that when those are available, and we will also announce that on our Facebook page. If you're moved to say anything similar or to contribute to that effort, please feel free to do so. You can do that by sending an email to crease@umich.edu. You can tell any of us, or you can post it on Facebook, which I understand is a good generational marker for the alumni divisions out there. And now, on with the show. REES, of course, has many legacies. We've showcased some of them this weekend, as you see on the program. One of the key arenas has been the center's work in enabling and encouraging excellent scholarship and teaching about our region, a region that has, of course, changed and grown since 1961. This panel showcases distinguished REES alumni in academia, and I'm going to turn the proceedings for the rest of this panel over to the senior REES alumnus present, I believe. That's George Breslauer, who is principally known to the world as the holder of a REES graduate certificate, actually in Russian studies from 1968. Beyond that, he has done other things, however. He is, of course, the longtime professor of political science at UC Berkeley, where he also chaired the Center on Slavic and East European Studies and held many other positions up to and including the distinguished post of Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, which is the post he now holds. We're honored to have him here. We're honored to have our other guests. We're honored to have you here, too. Please join me in welcoming Professor Breslauer.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. It's good to be out of California, good to be in Michigan. I have the honor of introducing the panel, or the panelists, but also I have the chore of enforcing time constraints. We're going to speak for 15 to 20 minutes each about what our University of Michigan educations contributed to the rest of our lives. And then we should still then have plenty of time for interaction with you, and there's a microphone on the aisle for that purpose, but as is usually the case in academia, we won't have the question and answers until all the presentations are given. You know, all University of Michigan REES graduates do well. Some do exceptionally well, and some do everything exceptionally well. And the panelists here today reflect that. We're going to speak in the following order. First, Val Bunce, then myself, then Doug Rogers, and then finally, Keely Stauter-Halsted. Let me start by introducing Val Bunce. Val is the complete package. I could take up 20 minutes just telling you about her 23-page vita. She does everything exceptionally well, and she is currently the Aaron L. Binenkorb Professor of International Studies and Professor of Government since 1991 at Cornell University. She did all of her higher education at Michigan. She started here as a freshman undergraduate and finished here with her PhD in 1976 in political science. Val has served as chair of the government department at Cornell, director of the Comparative Societal Analysis program at Cornell. She served in each of those capacities for 6 years 5 of the 6 years overlapped, so she gets probably a go blue for stamina. Val's first book was based upon her distinguished dissertation. The book was called Do New Leaders Make a Difference? Executive Succession and Public Policy Under Capitalism and Socialism. Her second book, Subversive Institutions, the Design and the Destruction of Socialism and the State. Third book, forthcoming, Democracy and Authoritarianism in the Post-Communist World, which is co-edited with Michael McFall and Catherine Stonerweiss. And the fourth book under review at Cambridge University Press.
Actually, that's old.
Is that right?
Yeah, okay, that's what.
Okay. Defeating, is it out already?
It is out in June.
It will be out in June?
Yeah.
Okay. Defeating Authoritarian Leaders in Mixed Regimes, U.S. Democracy Assistance, International Diffusion, and Local Electoral Struggles. In June, you can get it on Amazon. Val has also authored literally hundreds of papers, articles, and book chapters. That's just research and contributions to the administrative enterprise at Cornell. In addition, Val has served as president of the AAASS, vice president of the American Political Science Association, and has shown herself to be a spectacular teacher, being on the honor roll for Best Undergraduate Teacher in the College of Arts and Sciences at Northwestern University in no fewer than 6 years. Val, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, George. We were assigned 3 questions, so I will move through them as expeditiously as possible. The first question that Doug asked us to address was what motivated us to study the region. And I have to say that I could go through a long discussion. Well, I was a Cold War baby. The Soviet Union was the most important player in the international system aside from the United States, et cetera. But actually, it was an accident. I had a really close friend who lived in the dorm near me, and she told me about a new course, and Sve's giggling over there, a new course that was being offered for the first time. It was quite an unusual course called Survey of the Soviet Union, which was interdisciplinary. I had a slot open at 11 a.m. on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And so I took the course because my friend was taking it. And it was it was an epiphany taking that course. I mean, it completely changed my life. And part of the reason for that was that there were 3 very energetic assistant professors teaching the course. There were others as well. One was Walt Connor. Another one was Bill Rosenberg. And another one was Sve Giedelman. So I just completely fell in love at that moment and knew exactly what I wanted to do. Now, I went to graduate school at Michigan, in part because I was so impressed by this course and so fascinated by the material and the teaching, et cetera. But I also confess, I was married to a medical student at the time in the Michigan Med School, and so if I wanted to go to grad school, it made sense to go here. But it turned out to be a terrific choice for me. I look back on it, not just the people I already mentioned, but of course Bill Zimmerman, and in political science I also want to mention Sam Eldersveld, Bob Putnam, and Jack Walker, who were all very, very influential and really helped me develop in a lot of great ways, I think. And I had wonderful grad student colleagues. One of the nicest things that's happened to me over the last 6 years is that I've been co-authoring a book with my oldest friend from Michigan, Sharon Wolchik. And we had decades we did not work together. Of course, we commiserated about motherhood and God knows what all, but this is the first time we actually worked together. Okay, so that's how it all happened. Fascinating topic, but really it was the personal connection the individuals who were doing the teaching. Okay, let me turn now to the center in my life. I think it was really important, in part, and this is probably not politically correct. The political science department was pretty cold, pretty distant, and not really very interesting in a lot of ways. Okay. And as a graduate student, of course, you go towards things which are warm, interesting, stimulating, and the like. And the center really played that role for me, especially those dusty newspapers, and that really, this was in Lane Hall, but those endless numbers of dusty newspapers that we all used to pull out in order to try to figure out what was going on the basis of what now makes me realize a very thin database. It was through the center that I got what were called NDFLs at the time, which were language fellowships, now called FLASs, to help me study. And the languages pushed me in certain directions because at some point the government would not pay you tuition and stipend in order to do Russian. And you were forced to do an Eastern European language, and I flipped a coin, because I didn't really have any idea which Eastern European language I should do, but I had just been in Bulgaria and decided that's what I really wanted to do. But fortunately, the teacher of Bulgarian was on leave. So it ended up Serbo-Croatian. So that's how that happened. But it was, I think that the thing that was really interesting, I think, about the center at that time, this is the first half of the 70s, was that there were just so many interesting people at Michigan at that time that it was a very rich experience. You know, from Morris Bornstein, Bill Rosenberg, Roman Sporlak, there were a whole group of people, and it really expanded your horizons. Now, what was interesting, and I want to make a point here, in part in strong reaction to the kind of usual diatribes that one hears against area studies. The center really stretched me in terms of disciplines, liberated me from a narrow view of the world that comes from political science. But it was also interesting that the center was across from the China Center. And we, the China Center and the Soviet East European Center, were in constant interaction with each other. And so we were having our own Sino-Soviet dispute, in a way. And we interacted so much and became, so one of the things I want to say is that it really did stretch you. It stretched you geographically. One of the distinguishing aspects of Michigan, and in part this comes out of Zvi's contributions, is that Soviet types really were forced to know something about Eastern Europe. You know, they couldn't just dismiss them as the colonies and ignore them. Similarly, you had the disciplinary spread. But I think that was the most important thing, as well as the fact that the friendships that I had through the center, through graduates, my graduate friendships, were the ones that I have maintained my entire life. I'm wondering if, for example, is Bob Donia coming? Anyway, there were a group of us, and it was wonderful. Let me say a little bit about the research interests, and I'll be brief here. The broadening and deepening that the center contributed was very important, I think, for contributing to both my teaching and my research. Obviously, what happened to me and happened to Catherine Ververy and happened to a lot of us was that the system that we knew went bye-bye. And it didn't go bye-bye just overnight. Of course, it was a much more complex process. But the point is that if we had been just political scientists, or anthropologists, maybe. I don't know if I would go so far as to say that. If we had been just political scientists, we would not have been able to adapt, I think, to the very new political, social, and economic realities on the ground. I think that was extraordinarily important. The other part of it that I think is very important is that if I think about the work I've done over the course of my career, I can see that I began my career by making cross-regional comparative work on leadership succession and its impact on public policy. I was influenced very much by a lot of the things going on at the center and by the people who were mentoring me. But it's interesting that I went on to work on the Soviet bloc and Soviet bloc relations, and then somehow the historical training I had came back, and I started working on a comparison of Alexander II and Gorbachev, the two great reforming czars, one of the 19th century and one, of course, in the Soviet Union. Then I had to take up democratization, and then I had to do et cetera, et cetera. I don't need to rehearse all this, but I think that what was interesting is that many critiques of area studies really argue that one, narrow, and two, keep essentially, using the same hammer. That there's a narrowness and a lack of openness and flexibility in an intellectual sense. I think it's just the opposite. I think it's just the opposite. And that was, I really can't picture myself if I did not have the interactions and the opportunities through the center that I would have been able to make the transition to this whole very different, I did 9 states, and suddenly they're 27, and now they're 29, et cetera. All the things that happened that transformed the region. I'm also very much enjoying, I've gone back to my roots, and I'm now teaching a lot of courses on authoritarianism. And a lot of my experiences at Michigan and through the center are really coming back to me. And I'm assigning literature from that period, even. And the graduate students scratch their heads, but I think they understand. So, I think, to conclude, I'm enormously grateful. The experience of being at the center was really the most important part of my training. Thank you.
Well, the University of Michigan and REES, to summarize the themes that I'll go through, gave me 4 things. Gave me Russian language skills, gave me fellowships and other financial support, gave me intellectual inspiration and space, gave me personal encouragement of whatever I was trying to accomplish. There's no truth that the study of Soviet political processes prepared me for academic administration. This was held against me as I was being considered. Does he know anything but purge? No. Let me reflect back, but on reflecting back on sort of my intellectual biography and the contribution that this university and REES made to it, I'm very conscious that it's very easy to romanticize or idealize an earlier era, and I hope I won't be doing that. But also, it's all too easy to engage in self-promotion that makes it look as if you were not all that anxious about whether you were going to figure out what you were doing, that you were fairly clear in advance as to what you were going to find, and then you went and researched it and found it. All of those nice things that make it look as if your life is overdetermined to a far greater extent than it was. I do remember someone here, maybe it was Bill Zimmerman, educating me in the tactics of academia, and one of the points he made was, you write the introduction last. Well, that's related to this issue of to what extent do you foresee in advance, perhaps through setting up elaborate hypotheses, what you're going to end up doing. If there's anyone out there who did not experience deep anxiety, did not experience deep uncertainty in the course of going through graduate school and through a dissertation and into a career, I congratulate you. You're a very special person, and I hate you. How did I get there? Well, in junior high school and high school, back in 1958 to 62, I studied foreign languages. and discovered for the first time in my life my first real intellectual passion. I could not get enough of it. I found it engrossing and exhilarating to learn a foreign language. And so in middle school and high school, I studied Spanish and then Russian. I studied Russian back in, now to echo, and there are going to be a lot of echoes between what we say, not because of any grand scheme. I studied Russian because the school's Spanish teacher was also the school's Russian teacher. And she and I got along so well that when I was finally allowed to take a second language in high school, I chose Russian only because she was teaching it. She herself knew it only because when she was living in Spain in the 1930s, she hung out with the Soviet soldiers who were involved in the war and learned Russian that way. So anyway, I then decided when high school was coming to an end that I wanted to go to a university that really taught a lot of foreign languages and taught them well. And I got advice from some people, and University of Michigan was on that list, and University of Michigan is where I went. I came here as a would-be Spanish literature major, but I continued my study of Russian. And that study of Russian here introduced me not only to wonderful people, but wonderful activities. Edith Ignatieff, who is long since deceased, was my instructor in Russian for a number of courses. She was also the director of the play in which I took, the Russian language play in which I took a role. She was the sponsor of the Russian poetry reading contest in which I participated, and she was a mainstay at what I think was called back then, but correct me if anyone else was here and remembers otherwise, Ruski Kruzhok, the conversation club that we had. But by the time I reached my junior year, I realized that while I loved learning foreign languages, I didn't really want to make a living out of it. I didn't want, that is to say, to specialize in either literature or linguistics. And I didn't want to just become a translator. And so I wanted to use the languages. And here, again, is a parallel with Val. I grew up in a household during the Cold War in which at dinner time every day, our father would lead us in conversation about the day's news. And that made us highly politically attuned to the outside world and to what was happening. And so when it came to choosing a major, I decided on political science because I figured I'll look at the real world and use my Russian to boot, and that's how I combined political science with Russian language and Soviet studies. I was here from 1962 to 66 as an undergraduate. I stayed here in 1966 as a graduate student. Michigan was the only university to which I applied for graduate school that offered me financial support. And that is why I stayed. I have absolutely no regrets for having stayed. I think the explanation for my fate with respect to financial support was that my grade point average in my freshman year was 4.0. In my sophomore year was 3.0. In my junior year was 2.9. And in my senior year was 4.0. So during my sophomore and junior years, I was growing up. Having a ball, but growing up, and not paying very much attention to my studies until I realized in my senior year I've got to get into graduate school. I buckled back down again, and some professors here at Michigan saw me in classes at that time and gave me the benefit of the doubt, put their bets on me, and I was immensely grateful to get in and to get financial support. I was also funded by an NDFL fellowship through REES, and I also had to take an East European language in order to justify receiving the money, because I had already taken all the Russian courses that would qualify. So I took one semester of Polish, and I've not used it since. Having said that, I know Zvi Gittleman is going to test my Polish later on. But in any case, I took substantive coursework with Bill Zimmerman in Soviet politics and Soviet foreign policy, with Al Meyer, who, as with Bill, just educated me outside the classroom as much as inside the classroom. Took a wonderful research seminar on interest groups in Soviet and East European societies and politics with Roman Sporluk, which I did my first research project into that topic. And I also benefited from the fact that REES brought really interesting people here to supplement the curriculum and to be available. I took a course on Soviet economics with Michael Kaiser, he actually won my internal award for bravery because the man had a very, very pronounced lisp. And yet, when he lectured, he never avoided speaking about thesis, antithesis, synthesis. If you try that yourself and then realize you're up in front of 100 people, or however many, you realize that's a brave person who's willing not to skirt that when they had that disability. But Wolfgang Leonhard had an immense impact on me. He came here, I think it was the spring of 1967. I took his seminar. I sat in on some of his lectures. I hung out with him as much as I could on the side. He ignited within me a passion for tackling the most contentious issues in Soviet history. And he also taught me how to conduct responsible Kremlinology. And I think there I discovered within me another passion, a passion for the Talmudic study of Soviet politics, which is the way I would put it. In the form of support, again, Al Meyer got me invited in the summer of 1968 to a 2-month-long working seminar at the Institute for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Palo Alto. I spent 2 months there with distinguished scholars in the field working on the subject of comparative communism. And out of it came a book edited by Chalmers Johnson called Change in Communist Systems. But the lineup there was star-studded, and it was one of the most, certainly the most intense and intellectually, for me, groundbreaking experiences of my growing up life. And there I also met Alexander Dahlen, and we worked together on a chapter for that book and then turned that chapter into a book itself. So that was almost my opportunity to come out. And it's another example of the generosity of the mentors and scholars here. I've got to believe, even though I never read any of them, that the successive scholarships or fellowships that I got as a graduate student were a product of the supportive letters written for me by my mentors, and especially by Bill Zimmerman. Poor Bill kept getting asked throughout my career whether he would write a letter about me, first to get the job, then to get tenure, then to get promoted to full professor. Finally, he just wrote them back and said, "Promote him and leave me alone." But by early 1969, I had to decide on a dissertation topic. I knew it had to be an original contribution. I knew it had to be ambitious in scope and depth. The state of the field at the time was rather constricting. It was involved in a lot of either-or propositions and debates. Is it totalitarian or pluralist? Is it a modern industrial society or not? Is it bureaucratically rational or not? There, the landmark work on behalf of bureaucratic rationality was Jerry Huff's Soviet Prefects, which came out in, I think, 1968. Continuity, change, is it changing or is it basic continuity? That depended on your definition of change, your definition of system. Is it stable or not? Are leaders motivated by power or policy? Is the system reformable or not? We all wanted to know whether that system was reformable or not, but as time went on, we realized we were going to have to wait for Brezhnev to step aside. Brezhnev came to power when I was a junior undergraduate at Berkeley. Brezhnev was still in power when I got my PhD. He was still in power when I was promoted to tenure. And then for several years thereafter, and then he died. And so we were all on the edge of our seats to see what was going to come next. Andropov was starting to look interesting, but then he stepped away involuntarily. And along came Chernenko, and I thought I was going to shoot myself. I said, if this guy lasts the rest of my career, I'm out of here. I want to know. So, but fortunately he didn't, and we got. But going back to that conundrum of how you're going to pursue a dissertation in a field that had such scarcity of available evidence and such binary oppositions in the discourse of the field, you couldn't use survey research to any decisive extent. You couldn't do participatory observation. Ethnographies of power were too sensitive. Censorship on the most crucial issues such as corruption or relations within the apparatus of the Central Committee were also hidden from view. I was drawn to the study of the policy process, but I initially tried to get around censorship by studying a technical issue that wouldn't be viewed as fraught with political sensitivity. I chose rural infrastructure development. Well, I did. It took me longer, but I reached the same conclusion as Val. So I started gathering materials on that and studying them, and I eventually found that the topic was most likely to yield results that would not be particularly interesting for a political scientist, might be for someone in rural development. Every question or every answer I came up with, the response within me was, so what? You know, okay, it's incrementalism. So what? There's differentiation of interest within the bureaucracy. Yeah, so what? There's lack of reliable implementation. So what? So I completely switched my dissertation topic in midstream and decided to go back to Wolfgang Leonhard and Bill Zimmerman and to pursue a focus and a methodology that had always intrigued me. The focus being leadership, central elite politics, and elite perspectives, and how these had evolved since Stalin's death, and what this taught us about the nature of political change in the post-Stalin era. I discovered that I absolutely loved comparing Soviet leaders' speeches. That 6-hour speech by Brezhnev in 1971, that's one hell of a speech. In Moscow, one dissident dubbed me a chudak, a strange guy, when I revealed that I had read all of Khrushchev's and all of Brezhnev's speeches. Now, you have to understand, I didn't get intrinsic joy out of reading the speeches. It was in comparing the speeches with what had been said before or what was simultaneously being said by someone else that yielded those nuggets that you finally realized, whoa, something's changing or something's in conflict. And so I would literally, when I discovered this in a Pravda or in a Izvestia or in comparing the two, dance around my living room with joy. It's good to have a topic you're enthusiastic about. So I was no longer studying the technical issues and no longer studying their implementation. I was looking at the larger issues of Soviet politics in the post-Stalin era, and that became the basis of my book, Khrushchev and Brezhnev as Leaders, which came out in 1982. Now, the patterns that I discovered in the evolution of these leaders' public statements allowed me to periodize the post-Stalin era and the respective tenures of Khrushchev and Brezhnev. I referred often back to Bill Zimmerman's landmark book, Soviet Perspectives on International Relations, 1956 to 1967, which came out in the late 60s. And that periodicity that I was searching for told me a lot, at least hypothetically, about the policy process. I still didn't know how much I'd uncovered, though. Initially, I followed Bill Zimmerman by titling my doctoral dissertation, Soviet Elite Perspectives on Modern Society. But later, I put on my Wolfgang Leonhard hat and rethought the functions of those elite pronouncements. And I decided that you could treat elite pronouncements as efforts at impression management, political communication, political signaling, that were important to building your authority as a leader, maintaining your authority as a leader, seizing the initiative in political combat, biasing policy in preferred directions by giving license to central and local officials, as well as journalists, to seize the initiative themselves, since you've given them political cover by saying what you did publicly, and encouraging bandwagoning behavior among potential clients within the political hierarchy. Now, that is what I spent the 1970s doing after I had completed my dissertation, rethinking the functions of the statements that I had treated as signs of what leaders were thinking, and instead now was going to view them as part of political combat. My understanding of the issues on which I focused was less a product of my education at Michigan. I was at Berkeley when I finished my dissertation, and there, while I was rethinking the project once again and reinterpreting what I've just said. Taking an authority-building approach required me to understand the issues in the post-Stalin decade somewhat differently from what was standard. And for this, I owe a great intellectual debt to my colleagues at Berkeley, Ken Jowett, Gregory Grossman, and Philip Selznick. Ken Jowett wrote pioneering work in the early 90s, in the early 70s rather, mid-70s, on elite political culture and Leninist systems. Greg Grossman was a phenomenal resource for understanding the mechanics of the Soviet economy and for thinking about how Leninist elites think about the economy. He not only founded the term command economy, but also the concept of solidary society. And Philip Selznick, with whom I did not actually work, but who produced fabulous work on leadership, inspired me especially through his book, Leadership and Administration. So this fully developed framework then appeared in the book that I published on Khrushchev and Brezhnev. And then 20 years later, I published a book, Gorbachev and Yeltsin as Leaders, in which I employed the same framework, compared all four of those leaders, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, and Yeltsin, and even found analogous periodicity within the tenures in office of all four leaders, even though the changed content of policies with Gorbachev's shift to systemic transformation made for quite different political strategies as chosen by these four men. So in brief, Michigan provided me with foreign language skills, financial support, intellectual inspiration, personal encouragement, a powerful mix that launched my career in Soviet political studies. It's been a good, satisfying career. Thank you, Michigan. Thank you, REES, for having launched me. I'm ever grateful. The check is in the mail. Thank you. Our next speaker is Douglas Rogers, who is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Yale University. Doug received his PhD in anthropology at the University of Michigan in 2004. He has published a book entitled The Old Faith and the Russian Land, a historical ethnography of ethics in the Urals, Cornell University Press. He has also published almost a dozen articles in major outlets. Just to give you a few titles, to give you a sample of the kinds of things he works on. One article in Slavic Review called Post-Socialism's Unbound, Connections, Critiques, Comparisons. Another article, Old Belief Between Society and Culture, Remaking Moral Communities and Inequalities on a Former State Farm. Another, How to Be a Khazyain in a Transforming State, State Formation and the Ethics of Governance in Post-Soviet Russia. And a final one with the salacious title, Moonshine, Money, and the Politics of Liquidity in Rural Russia, in the American Ethnologist. Doug has also, in one decade out in academia, received grants from the National Science Foundation, IREX, the SSRC, the Woodrow Wilson Center, Fulbright Hayes, and the German Marshall Fund. He is also the winner of a Distinguished Graduate Student Instructor Award at Michigan, and he has reviewed articles for as many as 15 different journals. Another example of a Michigan graduate done well. Doug? Okay.
Well, thank you very much, George. I have to say that just being here is evoking in me some fairly powerful feelings of nostalgia, and I'm thinking that nostalgia is, to a certain extent, always about the present, and there are two possible presents that are causing this nostalgia, and it's some combination of them. One is that I now teach at Yale, which is a university that had decided in the late 1990s to eliminate its dedicated equivalent of CREES and merge it into European studies. So we now have a Council on European Studies that covers everything from Portugal to Sakhalin, which has many benefits, and there continue to be fantastic colleagues and fantastic community of people who work on Russia and Eastern Europe and Eurasia, but it seems to me that there is something missing, at least by comparison to my experience at Michigan. But I recognize, and this is the second potential reason for my nostalgia, is that this may be an artifact not of the difference between these two institutions, but of the fact that I was a carefree graduate student in one and am a harried junior faculty member in another. So somewhere between those two senses of self, I'd like to deliver you a few remarks on what CREES meant to me. I started learning Russian also in high school because in my case, the French teacher was also the Russian teacher, except after 4 years of Russian, it turned out that he didn't really know much Russian. I got to Middlebury College as a freshman and took the placement exam, and I remember very distinctly walking into the office of the chair of the department and him saying, "How many years of Russian did you have?" And I said, 4. And he said, "I'm sorry, you don't really look like you know all the letters. You're going you're going to need to start over," which I did. And I, somewhere along the way, picked up anthropology as well. I took a class in classics, actually, and my classics professor said that she really liked my paper, and maybe I should take an anthropology class at some point, and then I could come back to classics after having taken the anthropology class, and I never took another classics course ever again. So this was not a time when there were, this is the early 1990s, this is not a time when there was a field of Russianist anthropology. It was just beginning. People were doing field work. There were really, at that point, only a couple of books, and I just looked at my senior thesis from Middlebury the other day, and there are no references to any scholarship or any literature about, that combined Russian and anthropology. This was a complete coincidence and an empty field. So by the time I got to graduate school at Michigan in 1997, after a detour doing a master's in anthropology in England, I was sort of in the second full generation of anthropologists who were thinking about this region. And people were doing field work, books were beginning to come out, and this is the first point I want to make in talking about Michigan, and I'm going to sort of hold aside the anthropology part of my life at Michigan and talk mostly about CREES. But one of the things I'll mention is that, and this holds true for Title VI centers in general and CREES in particular, is that they can move and help to establish new fields of scholarship fairly quickly as compared to disciplines. It takes a long time to get a PhD and to get a job and to publish a book and to get tenure. And that kind of critical mass really didn't occur in the field of the anthropology of the former Soviet Union. Eastern Europe's a slightly different story, but in the former Soviet Union until the late 1990s, say. So by the time that I was kicking around in graduate school in the middle of the 1990s, it was largely through interdisciplinary conversations at CREES that I was able to sort of formulate what I was doing and what it meant to do anthropology in Russia. It was through conferences sponsored by CREES that I met many of the people who were beginning to put together this field. It was by coming to their talks in the CREES seminar series. It was because CREES could host postdocs who could come here and you could meet with them and talk with them and learn about how this field was developing. So that was a tremendous boost, I think, for me and for the field as a whole in those days, in sort of institutionalizing the anthropology of this part of the world, because all of a sudden you could do field work. This was a data-rich era in in the field of Russian and former Soviet and Eurasian studies. And everyone was trying to cope with how to deal with that. What kinds of research worked, and what were the arguments, and what were the stakes, and what was going on. So that's the first point I'd like to make. Oh, just one final point on that. It also mattered a great deal, CREES and associated area centers, for actually getting jobs in the academic world and outside of the academic world in this field. Both, the first job that I ever was considered for was a job that, at Indiana University, which was in the anthropology department, but funded by the Russian East European Institute. Postdoc that I eventually did get was at Miami University, also funded by a Russian East European Institute. So these kinds of centers can be crucial in working in collaboration with more traditional disciplines to actually get things going. Institutionalization, that was my first point. I also wanted to say a little bit about teaching and how Michigan, my time as a graduate student instructor at Michigan, taught me some things about teaching that, looking back on them, I think also had a lot to do with how my scholarship shaped up. I taught 3 times this insane course, Russian East European Studies 395, which was titled Introduction to Russia, the Soviet Union, and the Successor States. So I was one of the graduate student instructors for this class 3 times, and the class, for those of you who don't know it, is insane. It is a parade of all of the distinguished people sitting here and elsewhere at Michigan giving 1 lecture a day, and then the graduate student instructors have to sort of clean it up in discussion section. What continuity there is established by us, the graduate student instructors. And I remember when I was asked to teach this course, I went to Bill Rosenberg, who was the faculty coordinator of the course, and I said, Bill, you know, I think I can do this, but I don't really know much about any of this stuff. And he looked at me with this look that I've since learned to give my graduate students, which is sort of sympathetic, yet you really don't know the point. And he said, you know, how much do you think they know? It's okay if you're only, if you're only a step and a half ahead of them. That's right. So I learned 2 things. One of them was it's okay if you're a step and a half ahead of the students on occasion. And the other thing was that you can rely on the students to some extent. This was the first class I taught, and well, let me set this up. I'll go back a little bit. The other thing that was important about CREES for me at that time was that anthropology being a new field, I really felt the need and the utility of defining what I was interested in conversation with people in other more established disciplines. And for me, that was very much, well, a variety of conversations and courses, but especially history courses and history conversations. And I learned in a variety of settings in my early graduate school days that I could actually think about history. I couldn't be a historian because it turns out that in order to be a historian, you have to be good at remembering things that happened. And I'm very bad at that. But in a special section of one of Val Kivelson's classes on Russian Orthodoxy, which was just for graduate students, I had a wonderful time talking with 3 or 4 other graduate students and thinking about the history of religion. And in Bill Rosenberg's living room, where he convened this reading group of historians and anthropologists and others who were interested, I had a whole range of wonderful conversations that convinced me that I could sort of deal with history and ask some historical questions. So it was with that background, in fact, that I had applied to teach this crazy course and thought, well, maybe I can do it. And then when it came actually to the day of teaching it, I was thinking, well, okay, I know some of this history stuff, but whoa. I don't really remember any of the stuff that happened. So I got to the class and I was completely terrified. And on the second day, I realized that I had the best gift I've ever gotten as a teacher is that one of the students, one of the University of Michigan students in my class had been on Jeopardy. And he was known to the entire campus community as Jeopardy guy. And he knew all the stuff that I didn't. And so I don't exactly know when Peter the Great, what day he was, but he knew everything. So every time there was a question about Russian history, or anything else for that matter, I didn't really have to answer because he would sit there and he would do the crossword puzzle in the Michigan Daily and answer everybody's questions. And so by the second time I taught that class, I had sort of taken on board this experience, and I had begun to think of this class not as an exercise in insanity, but as, and this is what I would argue to the students later when I taught this is your entire liberal arts education in one semester. We ask you in the College of Literature, Science, and Arts to think about all of these broad different ways of approaching knowledge, but usually you do it in different classes, and now we're going to make you do it one day after the next. So Herb Eagle is going to come in one day and read, Mayakovsky at you, and then Zvi Gittleman will be there the next day to tell jokes about Soviet nationality policy, and then we'll be off to somebody else, and somebody else, and somebody else. And the fun of this class, I would say, to students is that you have to put it all together. And I can help you do that, but it's all there for you to put together. So those two things, I think, in my early years at REES were particularly significant for me, the institutionalization side and then the teaching and their intersection in thinking about history in particular. So around about the fourth year of graduate school, I went off, as anthropologists do, to do field work. And I was interested in, I had this project very nicely designed and well-funded and everything on religion in the post-Soviet period. And I was going to do field work in the Urals, in a village that was an Old Believer village. So most of you know something about Old Believers, very conservative offshoot of the Russian Orthodox Church, very traditional. And I was sort of interested in how they fared after the end of state-sponsored atheist propaganda and things like this. As it happened, as it always happens for the most part in fieldwork, that's not what the people there wanted to talk about, so I sort of turned up. And some of you may remember I was convinced by Russian colleagues to grow a very substantial beard in order to be accepted by the Old Believers in this community. The Old Believers in this community thought it was the most ridiculous thing they'd ever seen and demanded that I shave, which I did. So the project, became about many different things, things that people there wanted to talk about. And it became about, to a large extent, about history, because both they and many Russian colleagues who I was working with kept saying, well, you keep asking all this stuff about the post-Soviet period, you need to do much more history. You need to think about the history of this town. And so I did. And that became an important part of what eventually was a book. And the book actually covers 3 centuries of history in this particular town. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second, but I was fairly pleased that I had had all these conversations with Val and with Bill and with Brian Porter and others at the time before about history. And that, I felt like I was a little bit prepared for when things went wrong in fieldwork. But it turns out that sort of this backdoor route into history is not always the best one, because somewhere in the actual history classes, they tell you how to stop going backwards in your project, right? And no one ever told me that. So, people told me stuff about what happened 200 years ago. I said, well, that's going to have to be a chapter. And, so it took me forever to write this book because I didn't know how to say, okay, well, it's just going to be the Soviet period and now. So thank you, I think, to my historian colleagues for your suggestions and inspiration on that front. And the other thing that the general REES environment at the time in the 1990s, when anthropologists like me were forced in many ways to have interdisciplinary conversations and to think along with other more established disciplines, is that when people wanted to talk about privatization or they wanted to talk about politics in the village, these were things that I was a bit prepared to think about. Now, some of this has to do with my anthropology training, but I think a lot of it, and the particular themes that came up in the Russian and Soviet case, have to do with this broad range of interdisciplinary conversations that I was having and listening to and participating in, and that were so wonderfully facilitated by REES. So I think I will end there, and I will only say that that project is done, thankfully. It took up some 15 years of my life in one way or another. And I've started on a new project, which I'm somewhere in the beginning to middle of, which is about which will be eventually sort of an ethnography of the intersection of oil and culture in the Perm region of Russia, where the local division of Lukoil has become a very big sponsor of culture and a very big partner with the state in all sorts of initiatives. And I'm trying to do an ethnography of this relationship that plays out not just in a single town, but across the entire breadth of an important Russian region. So there's a lot of stuff on oil and gas and the Kremlin and oligarchs. I'd like a little bit better perspective on what's actually going on the ground in these kinds of relationships. And when I was thinking about this project, I got sort of dragged backwards into it by friends in Russia. I came back from a field trip to Russia and said, okay, well, I've been convinced this is going to be my next project. And I said, what am I going to do? And I was sort of looking around and I discovered that there was going to be a conference at REES hosted by Michael on this topic. And I wrote to Michael and Marish and I said, can I please come? I don't know anything yet, but I'd like to sit in the back and sort of take notes and find out what people are talking about. And they said, of course. So this project too, although it's still in the fairly inchoate stages, owes its early life to conversations in room 1636 of the International Institute. So thank you to everyone with whom I've had the chance to talk in that room and in so many other wonderful places here.
And now our next speaker will be Professor Keely Stauter-Halsted. She is presently professor and the holder of an endowed chair in the history of Poland at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Keely got her PhD here in the University of Michigan in history in 1993. She's published a book called The Nation in the Village, The Genesis of Rural National Identity in Austrian Poland, 1848 to 1900. Came out in 2001 and was the winner of the Orbis Prize for Outstanding Book on Polish Affairs. She has published 10 articles of major note, give you just a few titles: The Physician and the Fallen Woman, Medicalizing Prostitution in Polish Lands, A Generation of Monsters, Jews, Prostitution, and Racial Purity in the 1892 Lviv White Slavery Trial, The Moral Community and Peasant Nationalism in 19th Century Poland, and there are many, many more. She has, in her career, received research grants and other forms of fellowships and honors for her work from, just to name just a few, IREX, the American Council of Teachers of Russian, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Foreign Language Area Studies Fellowship. She has also given major service work to the institutions at which she worked from 2005 to 2009. She was Associate Chair and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of History at Michigan State University, from which she then transferred to the University of Illinois at Chicago. Keely?
Thank you. I feel my whole life is sort of passing before my eyes as people come and go in this room. So I feel like I belong to a generation that kind of bridges the period where the Soviet Union was a continuous entity and we sort of thought we understood that world, and the period after that all fell apart and we were trying to sort of refigure it out and recreate ourselves. I began my career at REES in the mid-1980s and then finished my doctoral work in history in the early 90s. So I started at a moment when János Kadar was still in power in Hungary, Erich Honecker was head of the party in East Germany, Poland was just coming off of martial law, and Ceausescu was still terrorizing his people in Romania. At the time when I began in REES, the Soviet Union was on its second aging leader after the death of Brezhnev, and it would still be another 2 years before Mikhail Gorbachev would become a household name around the world. But then by 1992, when I finished up my dissertation and was looking for jobs in history, all of these leaders were gone. And the system that they once ruled had collapsed. Germany had been reunified. There were now 15 new republics in the Soviet space. Yugoslavia was disintegrating. Czechoslovakia was on its way to a velvet divorce. So I feel like I was sort of part of a generation in which we relearned how to approach the world that we thought we understood, or that we understood the parameters of what we could study. We discovered that nationalism and ethnic attachments were not dead, but had actually been fostered under communism and played an important role in the post-socialist world as things settled out. We began to recognize the strength of civil society and the power of non-elite actors, even under the most repressive of these regimes, et cetera, et cetera. This in-betweenness played out even in terms of how we conducted our dissertation research. So I went to Poland in 1989 on a 10-month fellowship and soon discovered that this tumultuous political change took its toll on a research agenda. All the excitement of the '89 transitions meant that it was way more fun to hop on a train and go to Berlin and watch what was happening, or read newspapers, or watch the demonstrations, than it was to spend all of those long hours in the archives looking at dusty records. And for some of us, this temptation was even greater. I knew colleagues throughout Eastern Europe in that year who kind of just went native and stayed and became advisors to the regimes that were transitioning. So it was a very tumultuous time, important in a lot of respects to the way we formed ourselves as scholars and as people. I remember that year that inflation was so out of whack in Poland that one day my IREX check came, or my stipend came, and I bought a pair of gloves and an umbrella, and that was it. It was gone for the month. We couldn't get food because the farmers weren't selling their stuff to the market, and I didn't have connections to the villages. And then even more concretely, how do you get permission to access the archives when the archivist doesn't even know who's in power anymore and who she can request the permission? I couldn't get, toward the end of my stay in 1990, I wanted to get microfilm of the stuff I hadn't looked at, but there was no longer any actual cellophane, any of the plastic, because East Germany sold that to Poland, but East Germany was now becoming westernized and it wasn't selling stuff to Eastern Europe. So it was this kind of strange transitional moment in which I began my studies here. I came to the field of Eastern European studies through a path that may have been similar to a lot of folks in my generation. I had traveled in the region when I was an undergraduate on a study abroad program. In my case, in Vienna in the fall of 1982. And I guess I would say, similar to what the comments that Val was making, Vienna was a really boring, cold place. They weren't terribly friendly. And so, I traveled in Eastern Europe. The Poles were much warmer, much more accepting of a young American, and even excited to talk to one. And so I got sort of entranced by this sort of hidden world of communist resistance as I was traveling throughout the region. I talked to artists and literary figures, a lot of dissidents, and I became interested in the layers of society that lay beneath and outside of the reach of the state. And I guess, like many people, again, in that time period, I was captivated by the romance of solidarity in Poland, by the stories that my friends, my Polish and Czech and Hungarian friends told me. These were people who had left often Eastern Europe and come to Vienna to find some sort of artistic freedom, but the kinds of small acts of resistance that they talked about inspired me, and I found them really, really significant. I have to confess that I may not be alone in the fact that I was partly attracted to the field because of how impenetrable it was, how difficult it was to get access to information and to understand it, and how distant and remote it seemed from the world that I had come from. To this day, I retain vivid memories of my first trips to the region that underlie the sense of sort of otherness. I remember being followed by secret police. Okay, that's exciting when you're 20, right? I went to Bratislava to interview an artist, and she kept tapping me on the shoulder and saying, "Look behind, it's the same guys. They were at the restaurant there behind us." She was out with the regime because she was sculpting figures that were not socialist realist, and so she was in trouble with them. She had a secret workshop on the outside of town in Bratislava that she took me to, but we had to be very secretive. This is exciting, right? I remember having my mail censored when I was studying in the DDR. I remember that anxious feeling of trading money on the black with a series of shady characters on the streets in various cities in Poland. And then I'm sure we all remember all those tense border crossings on trains, buses, and minivans, and the terror that you would see inscribed on the faces of the East German citizens as we were about to cross over the border, and the police would come in with their German shepherds to sniff out the train compartments. I have no idea what they were looking for, but the population was just, the people in the train compartments were just terrified. And it always seemed to me that this was a really interesting reflection on state-society relations, that the people were so afraid of their police. And then that sense of relief as you cross the border. All of those early experiences helped to sort of exoticize Eastern Europe in a funny way for me. It made it both inaccessible and alluring at the same time. Little did I know that when I left Vienna that winter, a sequence of events had already been put in place that would transform Eastern Europe, the Eastern Europe that I had begun to explore. Brezhnev died that November, and change in the Eastern Bloc was already being discussed, although it would not become reality for another few years. So I returned to the US from these adventures, thinking I wanted to pursue a career in journalism. In the fall of 1984, I enrolled in REES and set about improving my language skills in Russian and in Polish. I too was the recipient of a FLAS and encouraged to study a second language. And then I took the widest possible selection of courses. Years later, after I decided to continue on and earn a doctorate in history, I was really grateful, as I think we all were, for the range of expertise that these classes provided. I studied dissident film and literature with Herb Eagle, Polish poetry with Bogdana Carpenter, East European politics with Zvi, and Marxist theory with Al Meyer. I took a seminar on peasant societies with Tidar Shanin. He was visiting one semester. And I TA'd the East European equivalent of the course that you have been talking about. Was Russian East European Studies 396, I think, where Michael Kennedy lectured on solidarity and John Fine did Balkan history. And of course, Roman Sporlik managed to cover 1,000 years of Polish history in a riveting 50 minutes. Each of these courses and each of these mentors informed my work in history as I began to refine my area of intended expertise. To this day, as I think we all do, I incorporate literature, film, Marxist analysis, and all of these sweeping themes from these lectures into my own teaching and my own research. Sometimes I'm asked to teach a course or do a guest lecture, and I kind of pull something out of the back recesses of my mind that Al Meyer would have said in one of these lectures. Just a little trope or a paradigm or a sketch on the blackboard that comes back to you, and you can kind of grab hold of it and build a lecture around it. REES provided, I think, a range of prisms from which to access this mysterious world of Eastern European society, more so than I think would have been available from any single discipline if I had just enrolled directly in a PhD program. It's worth remembering that the numbers of students involved in area studies in those days was huge by today's standards. I remember something like 30 MA students that were part of my cohort when I was coming through in the mid-'80s. I have no idea how we all funded ourselves. I suspect there was far more federal money in those days than there is today, but it was a fabulous set of colleagues, and I too keep in touch with many, many of them to this day. In any case, after I completed my MA in 1986, including a standard issue 100-plus page thesis on peasant newspapers in partition Poland, I decided the best way for me to remain connected to Eastern Europe was to earn a doctorate and pursue a career in academia. I thought I wanted to become a journalist, but it looked like the news media was moving away from Eastern Europe. Solidarity was gone. It wasn't so romantic anymore. We're now moving on to the non-romantic era of economic malaise in Eastern Europe. Gorbachev had just launched his reforms, but nobody knew what that was going to bring. And even independent travel in Eastern Europe was still not an option much because you always had to have an invitation to get to stay there for an extended period, and I wasn't really well connected enough to do that. So I was swept away by the big ideas introduced in Sporlik's lectures, nationalism, socialism, the ethnic division of labor, and I chose to study Polish history. But in so doing, at the time, I risked a poor job market because it seemed to many of us that by specializing in the Soviet Union, you had much better opportunity for a job when you finished because that's where the positions were. That was where many of the focuses were at other institutions. But the gamble paid off because a couple of years before I finished, the Berlin Wall fell, and many, many institutions in this country became interested in having somebody to comment on Eastern Europe. It was a time when the Yugoslavia situation was becoming part of the everyday news. And since very few institutions in America train Balkanists, anybody who knew anything about Eastern Europe seemed to be intriguing to a lot of these departments. And again, because I listened to all of these lectures and taught in a similar way the REES survey course, I could at least kind of fake it when I went on the job interviews. So that too was very, very helpful. So after ended up teaching in Northern Iowa for a year, and then was able to move to Michigan State and vacate that position for another Sporlick student, Konrad Sadkowski, who took my position in Iowa, and I came to Michigan State. For several years there, I would just go out and interview there were a lot of jobs, and it was kind of fun to just be on the market. Then things tightened up. Until recently, I think, when, at least in Eastern Europe, there are a series of ethnic communities that have started to sponsor these endowed chair positions, and now things are just kind of starting to percolate a little bit more. And that, indeed, is how I ended up at the University of Illinois Chicago. A very wealthy Polish emigre donated $10 million to hire 2 Polish studies faculty members and build a program. And I think that's a way in which the money that the federal government used to provide for all of these positions maybe is now being, to some degree, replaced by private endowments. I would say that even the years since I finished my doctorate have been a bit of a roller coaster in the field, and certainly for me in my own pursuits. I chose to work on all sorts of seemingly non-traditional topics, at least non-traditional for a Polish historian of the time, that Roman characterized at a recent lunch that I had with him as interesting. He didn't really seem to want to pursue them. Most of my work has been built on my interest in giving voice to the same non-elite population groups that initially attracted me to the field. So after my book on peasant nationalism, which Roman did approve, I worked on Jews and anti-Semitism in Poland. I learned a little Yiddish, taught some courses in Jewish history and on the Holocaust. I introduced a summer study abroad program on Jewish culture in Krakow. For 2 years, I directed MSU's Jewish Studies program, where I worked to bring more public programming to East European Jewish topics, in addition to MSU's concentration on Israel and the United States. More recently, my research has focused on gender issues, especially on the lives of poor and working class women in Poland's industrializing cities in the late 19th century. This interest is what prompted my current project and the monograph I'm now finishing on prostitutes and the prostitution debate in partition Poland. The book looks at the limited options that are available to poor peasant women who migrate from villages to Poland's urban centers, and the ways in which the visible presence of sex workers on city streets drove a variety of reform efforts. Yes, I lectured on this when I went to my job interview at Chicago last year, and you can just imagine how thrilled the Polish emigre community of Chicago was to learn after my job talk on hookers, brothels, sex trafficking, and eugenics that I had been offered the endowed chair position. It seems to me I still have a long ways to go in convincing Chicago's Poles that this more complicated and less heroic version of Polish history is of value to them. As it is, I teach Polish history with plenty of Jews and Ruthenians and peasants in the mix, additions that both, I think, confuse and entice my heritage students. Most of the students in the class I'm teaching now, anyway, are of Polish background, and they have never heard that there are Jews in Poland, for the most part. So it's a challenge, but it's a good one. Still, I welcome the opportunity, and I look forward to the challenge of incorporating these diverse populations into the mainstream narrative of Polish history. It seems to me I may have a slight uphill battle in working with Chicago's ethnic Poles because I am not myself of Polish background, and for the longest time, anybody who studied Polish topics was ethnically Polish. Nonetheless, I have long argued that subjects like Jewish history and Polish history achieve greater legitimacy to the extent that they are no longer only about the collective identity of those who study them. So it becomes an actual academic topic if it's not just about understanding your people. If anyone from any ethnic background can specialize in these fields, they become a more integral part of the academic conversation, I think, rather than the output of a closed subcommunity. Meanwhile, in and out of the academy, East European studies, I think, is becoming less and less of a discrete field and more connected to other places and other subjects. As we all continue to process the afterglow of the collapse of the Soviet bloc and the expansion of the European Union, we see that the younger generation coming of age in Eastern Europe itself today clearly identifies quite naturally as members of a broader European milieu rather than as residents of a ghettoized corner of the continent. I think that's really important. The students that I lecture when I go to Krakow, for example, to teach classes, see themselves as European. They don't have this kind of East European enclave sensibility that maybe some of us who were trained 20 years ago do. And I think this holds true for the younger generation of academics studying in the region as well. I attended a recent workshop on the state of the field, and this revealed a sort of a generational divide amongst academics between those of us who continue to see value in the area studies approach to East European history, and those who treat their research and teaching as extensions of broader thematic or theoretical concerns. And then there are projects that situate their subjects conceptually and thematically in space beyond Eastern Europe. For example, the exciting work of Alison Frank, who was also a Sprolix student, worked with him at Harvard. Alison is working on Trieste. She began as a Polish historian, worked on Austrian Galicia, but now she's working on Trieste as a port city and looking at it, the way that it links with the Mediterranean world via traffic in slaves and women and spices and oil. There are lots and lots of examples of this. Marcy Shore is doing fabulous work on the way that ideas penetrated Eastern Europe, including Wittgenstein in Poland. Even the history of genocide is now being done with a comparative dimension, such as the work of Tim Snyder and Norman Neymark. So I would say that all of these scholars have embraced the conceptual shifts that also informs the thinking of these young residents of Eastern Europe. They're treating the region as an integral part of a larger European and worldwide trend and analyzing it topically within these comparative frameworks. So in all of these ways, I think Eastern Europe as a region has become normalized and maybe even de-exoticized lately. So the question is, whither Russian and East European area studies in this context? I think we'll talk more about this tomorrow morning, but for now, I would like to submit that at least we've at least broadened the field of conceptual inquiry that Eastern Europe links to. Our research is more informed in the last 20 years by comparative work on nationalism and national indifference, ethnic cleansing, migration. We are beginning to talk about the history of childhood and of the family, and these are all things that can be done in a comparative framework. Many, many new avenues for investigation have opened up, and conversations with colleagues working in every part of the world are conceivably relevant to our studies. Of course, the archives have opened up. I never found them particularly closed in Poland in the 80s, but there's much less problem. That's the least of our problems. Yet I would also say that for those of us interested in the historical underpinnings of current problems, or in the legacy of multi-ethnic empires, or in issues of social and economic development, or indeed in long-term intellectual trends, there remains much of value to the regional approach. I continue to feel a greater sense of camaraderie with fellow scholars of Eastern Europe in any discipline than I often sense with those working elsewhere. Whether this is a result of our shared experiences in the field, of the common interest we bring to our work, or simply of having been trained in area studies programs like REES, I can't say. But what I can say is that despite all the changes in the region and in the historical discipline, I still identify as a scholar of Eastern Europe as much as I do as a historian. And I think that my mentors in REES, many of whom are sitting here, deserve the credit or perhaps the blame for this way of thinking. Thanks.
We have a little more than half an hour for interaction. Don't feel that you have to confine yourself to a question. You may have a comment, but hopefully not a full speech. You may have had some analogous experiences that you want to tell us tidbits about. If you'd like to, just go to the microphone.
I just want to say that I came to Michigan for CREES. And since I left Michigan because I couldn't get my hugs here, CREES is the thing that I miss the most. I had been teaching for 20 years at Johns Hopkins University, where there was only one other person who even knew what was east of the Elbe. And when I was asked by one of the people in the anthropology department if I'd be interested in moving here, the reason that I wanted to come was that I thought finally I could have colleagues and students who were interested in this part of the world. Having this resource made my work stronger. It gave me a sense of connection beyond what I had been used to having in anthropology at Johns Hopkins, and it is the love of my life. I'm really sorry not to be here, and I'm so glad that the institution is continuing.
Thank you all for the great reminiscences. That was very, very enjoyable to hear. You've probably been told, or perhaps have been told, that CREES cleverly combined this reunion with visits of prospective MA students, who are, some of them are in the audience. So I was wondering how many of you, because this wasn't entirely clear, actually got a CREES MA before you went on to a PhD in a discipline, or got what we called an area studies certificate then, which was, I think, maybe a requirement of Title VI funding for those of us in the older generation, and whether you think that early experience of kind of forced interdisciplinarity was important for you.
Well, I received the certificate at the same time as I was working toward an MA in political science and then a PhD. I always found the interdisciplinarity of area studies to be one of the main attractions of it because it was a holistic picture.
I think the other thing that was interesting, I mean, I wonder if George has the same memories I do. The area programs were more dynamic than the departments in a lot of ways. And one of those ways, because the world has changed a lot since this time, since the 70s, but the area programs were the ones that tended to bring in visitors, that tended to sponsor conferences, et cetera. And that was not so common actually in departments. So there was much more turnover and people coming and going, as I remember. I had the same experience that George did because, I mean, I had a certificate, right, but it was just on the way. My PhD.
We were both in political science, and I was in political science in the 60s, and survey research and the so-called behavioral revolution were all the rage, and were almost entirely irrelevant to my interest in the Soviet Union because I couldn't employ those tools. So I found the department to be less interesting than the center, but I think the department, as well as other social science disciplines, had the Institute for Social Research, through which they really generated a lot of excitement and brought in a lot of visitors, but focused on that narrow set of questions. Yeah.
Yeah, just quickly, more recently, I did also do a master's in REES along the way to getting my PhD in 2004, so I guess my master's was in 2001 or something like this. But I think a very important part of the sort of interdisciplinarity that I spoke about was not just at these events, but in taking precisely these courses in a range of disciplines. I think it was that little extra part over and above my more standard training in anthropology that really made the connection work very well for me. Absolutely.
I just have one quick thing to say. In a way, it seems to me that the MA in REES, which is what I did first, and then went on to the PhD program, made me braver. I didn't even know what a PhD was when I was 22. And what I knew was that I was interested in Eastern Europe, not that I wanted to go on and get a doctorate. So being allowed to shop the different disciplines for 2 years and then figure out how best to pursue that interest was really convenient. And by that time, I knew what a PhD was. So.
But I want to say that what we did, is Michael making here? Well, REES actually launched mini course that we taught together on Scriabin in early 90s. When Scriabin, and that was kind of preamble of tomorrow at Timirkanov's concert. When St. Petersburg Symphony came and performed with the sound and light effect his Prometheus. It's just important for me to notice that along with anthropology and social sciences and history and literature and politics and everything else, REES launched very early rediscovery of Scriabin. Together with Green and School of Music, it was a series of concerts and the mini course that in a way launched the recovery of the greatest early modernist in Russia. Thanks.
Hello. The panel was very interesting, and certainly it brought back many memories of the time that I was teaching Ukrainian here and taking courses for my PhD. And at the time, 1990-91, I remember the dynamic period of the very first group of students that went to Lviv State University when Professor Shpurlyuk was the chair, actually, the director of the Center for Russian and East European Studies. And many of those students came back with a great interest in the whole area, and in fact, I think we had one marriage out of that period. So the dynamics of REES certainly over the years was fantastic. To this day, I remember the 10th anniversary of the Polish Roundtable and Rakowski's speech. So there were many, many memorable periods that REES has left for all the students, graduate students, and in fact, the professors. Thank you.
You don't know where to look when you want to say something like this. But, you know, I just love everything that each of you said and all the conversations we've been having informally. But one of the things that I'd like to do in this moment is to just invite those who are watching later to think about this as an extraordinary network of scholars produced, of faculty collaborating, but also a case study, especially for those who are provosts or vice chancellors or presidents elsewhere, of how you create a network of collaboration that winds up having enormous effect across a field of Russian East European studies, across a world of scholars collaborating from Poland, from Estonia, from Russia, from Armenia, and to think about how this example might actually stimulate the imagination about how universities change. Because I think, you know, this crease wound up having a disproportionate effect on the character of the University of Michigan itself, because of the ways in which we could see crease affecting how units wind up collaborating across the whole university. So it's not only about Russian East European studies, but it's about how, I think Doug was saying, about how you recognize the liberal arts in a university, but also how a university becomes much more than a sum of its parts. And I think Crees provided that example, at least for me, but I think for many others as well. So we haven't toasted yet, but I think that will happen soon. So here's
I just really wanted to thank every single director present and past who are here. It's been a terrific ride from the time I started working for Bill Rosenberg, who recognized that I had something to offer to the center and began and launched my career, which is now over 25 years and going. And I think I see others here too that I'd like to recognize. Bill Zimmerman. Thank you so much for all of your support and for obviously launching the careers of so many students here. We have Ron. Is Ron here? Ron Sooney sat back down. Thank you, Ron. Thanks for coming to Michigan after Oberlin College and going away and coming back again and being such a vibrant force for Armenian studies, for Russian history, for so many graduate students who come back and continually remember their time with you. Val Kibbleson. Where's Val? Short time you were a CREES director, but maybe we'll have a chance to have you back again, hopefully. And current Doug Northrop, great boss and leader, and someone who we haven't even had a chance really to talk about it. I'm not going to, I'll talk about it. Doug's launching of the Central Eurasian program within CREES, his leadership in the search for a new professor of Central Asian Studies, which is, I hope, coming to termination soon, and his pushing of so many reforms within the center's master's programs, undergraduate degree programs, and just, I mean, constant and ever-present support for students and current and future. And I hope he'll stick around for a long time in that role as advisor. And then, of course, there's Catherine, who was world's most inspirational boss. I think there were times when what happened at CREES, it becoming part of a larger organization now, the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia. I think there were so many conversations. Actually, I have those conversations go back to conversations I had with Bill Rosenberg about could one administer Europe, East Europe, Central Europe, Russia, Eurasia in one place, and that has actually happened and come true. And it was with conversations with Catherine that I think we really foresaw the future of what we have now and what we have today. And we miss her terribly at Michigan. I can't even go there. It's a huge loss. And Romania will be forever emblazoned upon the trajectory of CREES because of her inspiration to bring so many interesting students both to anthropology and those to studying Romanian as well. And I also want to thank Jane Burbank, who's not here today, but Jane was a very, very courageous leader of CREES and forged so many relationships with institutions in the region that I think we're still benefiting from today. She and her colleagues brought Afanasieff. They brought and fostered the career of Yefim Pivovar, who is the rector of the Russian State University for the Humanities, and really pushed us in establishing some interdisciplinary and overseas courses that and study abroad opportunities that we're still living off all those inspirational administrative I think challenges that she really met. So I hope I haven't left anybody off. Oh, I left Michael off. Oh my God, years and years and years with Michael Kennedy. I'm so sorry, Michael. I really. Michael came to Michigan as a young assistant professor in sociology, and I watched his career build from that of a, I think, almost timid, young professor to that of a very, very, very skilled faculty member, mentor to so many students, magnet to students, and administrative really wizard who helped me and us find a donor who was able to, really establish the new Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia. And I have Michael, and we all have Michael to thank for all those years of working together in that, with that goal in mind. And it's so nice to see everybody here, friends. And it was fun to put the panels together and to see and to correspond with all of our really wonderful students all over the world who've come together today and tomorrow, and we'll be talking about their experiences. So thank you so much for coming. And we'll see you for a drink.
After that celebration and call to drink, it would be a hostile act for somebody to say, now I want to speak. So why don't we just break for the lounge?